Don't fall for the inflation fear mongering, my friends. So I'm listening to a Mises Institute discussion. I forgot the guy. Oh, it was Salerno. I think it's Joseph Salerno. 10, 15 years or so ago, weighing Murray Rothbard versus Milton Friedman. And us Austrian types who are sympathetic to the Austrian school of Ludwig von Mises, Karl Menger, Rothbard, Hazlitt, things of that nature, Hayek, we don't quite subscribe to the monetarist theory at all, actually. So the monetarist theory of Friedman and stuff, inflation is always and everywhere, a monetary thing, and too much goods, too much money chasing too few goods, and all that. The Austrians don't necessarily fall for that hook, line, sinker. Now, we're more aligned with the Friedmanists than we would be the modern monetary theorists, the Keynesians, never mind the Marxists. But be it as it may. So Murray Rothbard, where he was chastising, probably too strong a word, disagreeing, I guess, with Milton Friedman, says the problem with these guys, the Friedmanists, is that they don't understand real inflation. Everyone has their own personal rate of inflation, and that's a wonderful observation. Wonderful, and that is not being measured in CPI, Consumer Price Index. So you can sit there and say all day long, inflation is going up this or going up that, but for me specifically, it has nothing to do with what your government mandated inflation numbers are. It's for me different. And what Rothbard was saying, he bought his biggest item of purchase is the books, essentially. He didn't say anything about housing, but his books. He buys a lot of books. And the price of books is going up through the roof, but that's not in the CPI numbers. This is back in the 70s and 80s. I think it's 70s or 80s he was observing this. It was the price of, maybe even the 90s. The price of books wasn't going up. It wasn't included in the CPI, and as such, the CPI is irrelevant to him. I'm sitting there thinking, I can't believe Salerno didn't get this. I'm like, well, okay, that's true, if that's true, and I think it is 100% true. But you know what's happening to the price of books now? I mean, the price of books is dropping like a brick in water because you can read all the books you could possibly imagine on your iPhone, via Kindle, you can borrow them from the library on this thing called Libby, all these things on your Kindle, and save them and store them. Now, I still like hard copies for sure, right? Of books of nonfiction. Fiction books, I just get on there. I just read a Stephen King, costs like $3.99. Actually, I was reading an article the other day about the price of textbooks going there. So they went up with a rate of 3 times the rate of inflation for the first 15 years of this century, and now they're just leveling off. Now they're going down. So the professors who thought they're going to make bank on issuing their own textbooks to be bought at $100, $110 per student, or else you fail the class, those days are long gone. And I'm just sitting there thinking, your personal inflation rate is all that matters. And as such, what is going up, what is going down isn't being reflected in the CPI necessarily. Just not. So if they're using housing and you buy your house and you own it outright, the only thing that increase in housing costs would be what? Property taxes, homeowners insurance, but the cost of your house is staying flat, which means relative to the devaluing of a 2 to 3% each year clip of the dollar is actually going down. The cost is going down. And as such, we're sitting there thinking, wait a second. Now you could say, well, the maintenance is going up, put the roof, a new HVAC, 100%. That's true. Hold on a second, my dog is barking. Beautiful thing where technology comes in and where, I hate to say ingenuity, redneck engineering, but when the government gets the hell out of Dodge, things can transpire wonderfully to decrease the cost of your life. However, what happens is always what happens. I'm going to read you this from Southern Reconstruct. You got to read this. The Northern aggression is just insane. This has nothing to do with Civil War. But the Northern economic aggression is nuts. I'll do another video on this. So I want to read this real quick because this is crazy. In 1889, when Andrew Carnegie toured the emerging Southern steel industry in Birmingham, he declared, "The South is Pennsylvania's most formidable industrial enemy." About 10 years later, Carnegie's mills were merged into U.S. Steel, Pittsburgh-based. 6 years later, U.S. Steel purchased the biggest Southern steels and imposed discriminatory pricing on Southern production. Thereafter, steel from the company's Alabama mills included an incremental markup, turned the Birmingham differential of $3 a ton over Pittsburgh. To further penalize Alabama production, buyers of Birmingham steel were required to pay freight from Birmingham plus a phantom charge as if the shipments were originated from Pittsburgh. Crazy. 6 months after the differential was finally abolished in 1939, shipbuilding plants in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and Mobile, Alabama announced major expansions. Wonder why. So your personal inflation rate, if you live in the South, is different than if you lived in the North. But it gets even worse than that. Check. Due to a shortage of capital in the South for many years after the Civil War, Northern railroads steadily increased their ownership of Southern operators. They quickly began using the rate differentials to block Southern competition to principal Northern shippers such as steel producers and the makers of other manufacturing goods. As a means of impeding competition from Southern and Western manufacturers, the discriminatory rates were effective as a protective tariffs, which were constitutionally prohibited between the states. All right, so hold on just a second. Then we got the ICC, which was the Interstate, what was that called? The Interstate Commerce Commission. So check this out. How come no inflationary fear mongers ever talk about this? After World War I, America's railroads were returned to the private operators because they're nationalized for World War I. The ICC was given a new mission in the 1920 Transportation Act. Its policy shifted from one of protecting the public from rate abuses to one of ensuring the health of the railroad industry. Railroads were not permitted to freely operate or to compete. Interesting. So what does that do to prices? The ICC issued certificates of convenience and necessity that define the route structure of each railroad. It established minimum rates which prevented any railroad from gaining market share by offering rates below the minimum. The revised policy remained in place until 1975. You hear where I'm going with that? Also, I just find it funny because they got a guy who was the Confederacy's previous postmaster general. In 1874, he's elected when whites were able to vote again in the South from Texas. He introduced a railroad regulation bill that outlawed discriminatory rates, blah, blah, blah. Unlike previous proposals, though, his bill did not include a commission because it was concerned that railroad interests might dominate it. Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. Because the ICC then became one to make sure that the health of the railroad industry, as opposed to going against discriminatory rates. But the revised policy remained in place where you cannot compete on price until 1975. So what normally happens after you get rid of price controls is normally a bump in the price for about a year or two. Because you've kept the prices down essentially. And then what happens is when that kind of is allowed to evaporate, people just all of a sudden there would be a jump up in price, which would certainly led to the inflation of the late 70s as well. But then as people start dealing with the lower cost, potentially, the more competition available and stuff, then magically competition ensues and the prices start going down. Interesting. I'm telling you, man, this happened with trucking, the trains. This happened, and I wonder if this led to the trucking deregulation too, because they could no longer compete with trains. It led to airlines when they got rid of the price controls for air passengers and stuff like that. Stock brokerage commissions, all that stuff. So the initial inflation of the 70s, obviously OPEC has something to do with it, wage and price controls of stupid Nixon. But the late 70s, when we got rid of a lot of that crap to go to deregulation, initially you're going to have this big jump in inflation. And everyone wants to say it's Volcker who got rid of it. This government was still spending like drunken sailors, man. And so as such, you can't say to me, well, the government's spending like drunken sailors, thus inflation. Okay, show me evidence of that. Evidence, I just want to see it. Because the inflation that matters, again, is only your personal inflation rate. And a lot of stuff you're buying now is a hell of a lot cheaper than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. It just is, man. Natural gas, hell of a lot cheaper. Why do you think we went to coal in the 70s? Because we couldn't find any more natural gas. Now natural gas is abundant and it's freaking cheap as can be. Anyway, I sit there and listen to these inflation people. I'm like, it's just so trite. Government printing inflation. And without any clue about what causes inflation. Again, inflation is caused by scarcity, which is caused by government regulation. I 100% agree with that. 100%. And that's my concern, Frank. I grant you that is a concern of mine is government regulation, especially with lockdowns and all this nuts. But don't don't listen. Man, I'm telling you, it's so easy to fall suspect or prey to these guys because they talk such a good argument. But if Murray Rothbard got it wrong, again, my inflation isn't being included in the CPI because I buy a lot of books and books are more expensive. Well, I buy a lot of natural gas, and a lot of natural gas is more expensive. You would have said that in the 70s too. And lo and behold, books and natural gas are a hell of a lot cheaper than they were back then. All right, we'll see you. Love your thoughts.